The ground trembled, not with the sudden violence of an earthquake, but with the slow and deliberate heartbeat of giants. Each step of the mammoths pressed history deeper into the cracked desert floor, the sound rolling across the Arizona basin like distant thunder. Dust rose around their legs in soft halos, blurring the edges between creature and landscape until they seemed carved from the same ancient stone. At their head moved the matriarch, older than memory, her tusks curving toward the earth like the crescents of a dying moon. The air shimmered around her massive form. Not from heat, it was still dawn, and the desert had not yet decided to burn, but from presence. Her eyes, dark and wet and impossibly deep, scanned the horizon not with fear but with something heavier. She carried, as all matriarchs did, the memory of paths carved over centuries, of springs that never failed, of storms survived and calves buried. Behind her followed 5 more mammoths. A pregnant female heavy with new life, 2 juveniles pressed so tightly to their mother's flanks they might have been carved there, and 2 younger adults whose power was raw but whose instincts still bent toward her guidance. Together they moved as one, a living river of flesh and bone, drawn forward by the promise of water. And waiting for them, crouched low in the brittle grass, were 13 men who believed they could kill gods. Dakota, the one they called leader, not because he was strongest, but because he listened most, pressed his palm to the earth. He felt the tremors through his bones, each vibration mapping the herd's position with more precision than sight could offer. 6 mammoths, maybe 7. His mind did not simply count them. It measured angles, wind shifts, the way the grass bent beneath the invisible hand of the morning breeze. "They know we're here," whispered Nakai beside him, voice thin as the desert wind. Nakai's spear shook slightly in his hands, though whether from fear or anticipation was impossible to tell. The obsidian point caught the first pale light of morning and gleamed like liquid shadow. Dakota did not look up. "Of course they know," he murmured, voice low and steady. "But even giants have to drink." This was no reckless ambush. It was a choreography older than memory. The Clovis people did not waste life, not their own, not the beasts they hunted. For 7 days they had tracked this family of mammoths from the Hookah Mountains across the open grasslands, eating little, speaking less, saving all their strength for this single moment. Hunger had hollowed them, but it had also sharpened them. Hunger had a way of stripping away illusion, leaving only purpose. Somewhere in the stillness, a raven called, its jagged cry cutting through the air like a flint strike. Dakota glanced toward the ridgeline, noting its direction the way his grandfather had taught him. Ravens did not lie. They were witnesses, eternal and impartial, their black wings folding history into the sky. He reached for his atlatl, the spear thrower that would multiply his arm's power 3-fold, and tested its weight. The weapon was more than wood and cord. It was a promise carved from necessity. Modern archaeologists would one day marvel at its efficiency, call it evidence of genius. But to Dakota it was simpler. It was the bridge between imagining survival and achieving it. 3 moons earlier, in a cave overlooking the Salt River, he had watched that bridge take shape. His grandfather, Aote, hands scarred by 40 winters of shaping stone, had sat cross-legged by the fire. The obsidian core rested on his knee, black as frozen night. "This," Aote had said, voice as steady as the river outside, "will be my last point." Dakota had frowned. "Why the last?" "Because," Aote replied with a small, enigmatic smile, "I have nothing left to teach it. Everything I know lives inside this stone." He had struck then, a river cobble in his hand, and the cave filled with the music of creation. Strike, pressure, flake. Each sound was a word, each word a prayer, each prayer a lesson passed down through generations who had learned the cost of getting it wrong. "The mammoths hide," Ode explained as he worked, is 4 fingers thick. The point must be long enough to reach the heart, strong enough to pierce bone, sharp enough to slice vessels without breaking. The stone obeyed him, sloughing away imperfections in perfect butterfly wing flakes until what remained was both weapon and memory. Finally, Aod had dipped his finger in ash and drawn on the cave wall. The silhouette of a mammoth, massive and eternal. With the tip of the finished point, he marked 2 spots. "Here," he said, tapping just behind the foreleg, "and the heart will open like a door. And here," he marked higher, "and you shatter the point, shatter yourself, and die beneath its feet." Now, crouched in the grass, with dawn staining the valley in colors of blood and gold, Dakota felt his grandfather's hand guiding his own. He could almost smell the smoke of that cave, hear the rhythmic song of stone shaping stone. "Always the matriarch first," Nakai whispered, as though repeating a sacred incantation. Dakota nodded. It wasn't just strategy. It was philosophy. To break the herd, you removed its memory. Kill the one who carried the map of their world, and the rest would wander blind. Yet, even as he drew a slow breath, steadying the tremor in his chest, he wondered if there were truths too dangerous to learn. If victory was not simply a feast, but a fracture. Thousands of years later, an archaeologist named Dr. Sarah Chen would kneel in this very valley. Her hands would tremble as she brushed away 13 Urod years of dust to reveal an obsidian point still hafted to its broken shaft. Beside it, pressed into the ancient black mat of algae and sediment, she would find a human handprint, its lines still clear, as if the man who made it had only just risen to his feet. "My God," her assistant would whisper. But Sarah would not answer, because in that moment she would understand something terrifying. These people had not simply killed mammoths. They had killed the future those mammoths represented, and in doing so, had created the future we inherited. The herd approached the spring now, each step deliberate, almost ceremonial. The matriarch paused at the water's edge, lifting her trunk to taste the air. She turned her massive head slightly, her eyes catching the sun, and for an instant, it seemed she was not looking at the hunters but through them, as though she could already see what they would become. Dakota's muscles coiled. Around him, 12 others mirrored his movement, their bodies taut as bowstrings, their breath synchronized with the earth itself. Somewhere behind the ridgeline, a thin thread of smoke curled upward where no fire should have been. Dakota's gaze flicked toward it, then back to the mammoth, and a thought colder than obsidian carved itself into his mind. We are not just hunting mammoths, we are hunting the future itself. The wind shifted first, carrying with it the musk of giants, warm, earthy, and tinged with the faint sweetness of crushed grass. To Dakota, it was not merely a smell but a signal, a reminder that the window of opportunity was narrowing. The mammoths would soon sense what lay hidden in the stillness. He raised his hand. A silent command rippled through the hunters like the tightening of a single muscle. They had rehearsed this for days, tracing the valley in their minds the way their ancestors had traced constellations in the sky. Every tuft of grass, every curve of land had been memorized until the terrain itself seemed to whisper its secrets. It wasn't just a hunt, it was a performance. And in this performance, mistakes were not corrected, they were buried. Nakai crouched 2 paces to Dakota's right, the obsidian point of his spear glinting like a shard of night. His breath came fast, shallow, and each exhale puffed a thin cloud into the morning air. Ayana, older than most of them but with eyes as sharp as any blade, positioned herself near the rear, ready to cut off escape if the herd broke in the wrong direction. Dakota's thoughts moved ahead of his body. The matriarch first. Always the matriarch. A goat's voice, carried across years and firelit caves, settled into him like a stone dropping into still water. He had watched the old man study mammoths not as enemies, but as teachers. They show us how to live, Aod had once said, and by killing them, we learn how to die. The mammoths reached the spring. The matriarch lowered her trunk, testing the water. Around her, the others shifted and rumbled softly, their low-frequency calls vibrating through the earth in ways the human ear could only partly grasp. To the hunters, those sounds were alien and intimate all at once, the language of an ancient world they were about to end. Dakota signaled again. The hunters rose as one, emerging from the grass like phantoms made flesh. Spears lifted, atlatls drawn back, bodies coiled with purpose. For an instant, time seemed to hesitate, as though the universe itself was unsure whether to allow what was about to happen. Then Nakai threw. His spear cut through the air with a sound that was more felt than heard, an extension of every hour he had spent shaping, sharpening, and believing. The Clovis point found its mark behind the matriarch's foreleg, sinking deep enough to make her bellow in a voice that shook the marrow of every living thing in the valley. The hunt began. The mammoths erupted into motion, a chaos so massive it bordered on geological. Dust rose in choking clouds as their feet churned the earth into a storm of pulverized stone and root. The pregnant female swung wide, her tusks scything the air as she tried to shield the juveniles. The younger bulls surged forward, intent on crushing whatever dared challenge their kin. Dakota's spear followed Nakai's, arcing perfectly into the matriarch's throat. Blood spurted in a jet so vivid it seemed unreal, spraying across the brittle grass like a painter's first, reckless stroke. Ayana sprinted forward, her atlatl snapping with practiced grace. Her spear glanced off a rib and shattered, the fluted point splintering into useless shards. She didn't pause. Another spear was already in her hand, another calculation already unfolding in her mind. "Circle them!" Dakota roared, his voice swallowed almost immediately by the cacophony of trumpets and screams. The hunters obeyed, breaking into two groups that flanked the herd like wolves. They darted in and out of cover, using every rise and dip of the land as both shield and weapon. Spears flew in deadly arcs, some finding flesh, others glancing harmlessly away, but each one pushed the mammoths closer to the center of the trap they had drawn into the earth itself. The matriarch charged. Her eyes locked on Dakota as though she had chosen him personally, as though this was no longer a hunt but a trial. Each step of hers consumed the space between them with impossible speed. Her trunk lashed out, smashing a mesquite tree into splinters, and her tusks carved twin crescents through the air. Dakota didn't move at first. He let her come. He needed her close enough that the third spear, the one Ayana had sharpened to a razor's edge over hours of silent, focused labor, would land exactly where it needed to. He pivoted at the last possible moment, the muscles in his legs screaming with the violence of the motion. The spear flew from his atlatl like a star torn from the sky and buried itself deep into the hollow beneath her jaw. The matriarch staggered but didn't fall. Nakai screamed Dakota's name and hurled his second spear, striking her in the shoulder. Ayana, now at Dakota's flank, drove her weapon into the soft flesh behind the foreleg, just as Aori had taught them. This time, the great beast faltered. Her trumpeting became a ragged wheeze, a sound so full of defiance it bordered on sacred. She took one more step, then another, her knees trembling as though she were trying to kneel but had forgotten how. Finally, she collapsed. The impact shook the valley like a drumbeat announcing the end of an age. Around her, the herd hesitated. Confusion spread through them like a disease. The pregnant female trumpeted desperately, the juveniles pressing against her as though she could shield them from what they didn't understand. The hunters didn't hesitate. They surged forward, turning hesitation into slaughter. Spears became extensions of will, obsidian points finding ribs, throats, and hearts with horrifying efficiency. It wasn't cruelty, It was clarity. In this place, on this morning, mercy had no meaning. When it was over, 5 mammoths lay dead. The hunters stood among them, panting, blood-slick and dust-caked, their faces masks of triumph and grief welded together. Dakota looked at the matriarch's eyes, now dim, and felt something he could not name. "This," he said softly, though no one had asked, "is the price of being human?" And then he saw it. On the far ridge, where the dust had begun to settle, figures appeared, thin and sharp against the newborn sun. Smoke rose behind them, not from accident, but from intention. Rival hunters, drawn by the smell of blood. For a moment after the last mammoth fell, there was only silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the silence that follows an explosion, a vacuum left by violence too immense to comprehend. The hunters stood scattered among the hulks of the dead, their chests heaving, their hands trembling around hafts slick with blood. They were alive, though each one carried new wounds. A gash across Nakai's forearm, a deep bruise blooming on Ayana's ribs, Dakota's shoulder burning from where a tusk had grazed him hard enough to numb the arm. Around them, the valley was transformed. What had been grass and dust an hour ago was now an altar. Blood soaked the earth in wide, glistening sheets, steam rising where it met the morning sun. The smell was suffocating. Iron and musk, sweet and rancid at once. Ayana broke first, dropping to her knees beside the matriarch's massive head. She pressed a hand against the cooling skin, her fingers dwarfed by the enormity of it. "She gave us everything," she murmured, voice thick with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite reverence. "We must not forget that." Dakota crouched beside her but said nothing. He couldn't. Words felt obscene here, like carving graffiti into stone meant for prayer. He traced the line of the tusk with his hand, feeling each groove where decades of storms had etched themselves into ivory. This creature had lived 100 winters, maybe more, and now her story ended at his feet. The others moved with mechanical purpose, their training pushing them forward even as their minds lagged behind. Spears were retrieved, broken shafts cast aside, usable points wiped clean and inspected. The younger hunters began cutting into the smallest carcass, their blades working in practiced motions. Slice, twist, separate. They didn't speak. Save everything. The words of their ancestors hummed through them like muscle memory. The sinew would become thread. The bones would become tools. The fat would be rendered into fuel. Nothing wasted. Nothing dishonored. That was the law, and breaking it was unthinkable. Yet beneath that ritual order ran another current, quicker, sharper, harder to name. Victory. Not the kind that lifted the spirit, but the kind that tightened the jaw and narrowed the eyes. The kind that whispered, "We did this. We can do it again." A raven landed on the matriarch's tusk, cocked its head, and gave a single, guttural call. Another answered from somewhere beyond the ridge. Soon there would be dozens, maybe hundreds, drawn to the feast that was no longer theirs to challenge, but theirs to witness. Dakota straightened, scanning the horizon. His instincts, honed over years of following trails and reading signs, prickled with unease. The hunt was over, but the danger had not passed. He saw them then. Figures on the ridge to the north, thin as spear shafts, their silhouettes flickering like shadows against the rising sun. At first, he thought they were ghosts, the kind that hunters sometimes imagined when the weight of killing pressed too heavily on their minds. But these did not fade. These grew sharper, more solid, more undeniable with each heartbeat. "Dakota," Nakai said, voice low but urgent. "We're not alone." The rival hunters made no effort to hide. Their presence was deliberate, almost theatrical. Smoke rose behind them in a thin column, its meaning unmistakable. We saw what you did, and we are coming. Ayanna rose to her feet, her hand still stained red from the matriarch's blood. She followed Dakota's gaze, her face hardening as she understood. They waited, she said flatly. Waited for us to do the work. Or, Nakai added bitterly, they waited to see if we would fail. The rival group began to descend the ridge, slow and measured, like predators savoring the moment before the strike. There were maybe 20 of them, more than Dakota's 13, and though their weapons looked similar, their movements were different. Sharper, hungrier. Dakota's mind raced. Tradition said a kill site was sacred. The meat, the tusks, even the blood belonged to those who had taken the risk, paid the cost. But tradition was a fragile thing, as easily shattered as obsidian under the wrong pressure. They'll want to share, Ayanna said, though her tone made clear she didn't believe sharing was their goal. They'll want it all, Nakai corrected. Dakota said nothing. His hand tightened around his spear, though his body screamed from exhaustion. They had just fought gods and won. Now they were about to fight something worse. People who looked like them, thought like them, and wanted what they had taken. The rival hunters reached the edge of the killing ground and stopped. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting across his jaw, stepped forward. He didn't raise his weapon, but he didn't lower it either. This valley smells of blood, he said, his voice carrying easily over the distance. And blood belongs to everyone. Dakota didn't move. He knew better than to answer first. In moments like this, words were not for communication, they were for measuring. The leader smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We watched you bring them down. Impressive. Risky. His gaze swept over the carcasses, calculating the wealth of meat, bone, and ivory lying between them. But why should 13 eat what could feed many more? Ayanna stepped closer to Dakota, her whisper so soft only he could hear. If we give them anything, they will take everything. Dakota's thoughts spun like a flint struck too many times. He felt the weight of the moment settle on him, heavier than any spear, heavier even than the matriarch's tusks. This was not just about meat. This was about what kind of story the earth would remember. He took a breath, slow and deliberate, tasting the copper in the air, the dust in his teeth. The raven on the tusk tilted its head, watching him, as if it too waited to see what kind of creature Dakota would choose to be. And then the leader of the rival band lifted his spear, not as a gesture of threat, but as a gesture of claim. The hunters behind him followed suit. Dakota's grip tightened. The killing ground was about to host another hunt. The killing ground had gone quiet again, but it was not the stillness of peace. It was the kind of silence that lives in the moment before a storm, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the skin, thick and suffocating. Dakota stood at the center of it, blood drying in dark streaks across his arms, his breath still uneven from the hunt. Behind him, his people worked with forced efficiency, carving meat, separating sinew, and stacking bones. But their movements were no longer steady. Every knife stroke was a little too sharp, every glance a little too quick. They felt the weight coming down the ridge as surely as they had once felt the mammoths approach. The rival hunters descended slowly, deliberately. 20 of them, each carrying weapons as dark and sharp as their eyes. Their leader, the scar-jawed man, walked in front, his posture relaxed but his steps precise, like a predator that knows it has the advantage. The smoke behind them curled upward in a thin column, marking their approach as if they wanted the whole valley to witness this moment. Dakota didn't move to meet them. That would have been weakness, an eagerness to explain himself. Instead, he waited where he was, beside the matriarch's massive head, his hand resting lightly on the haft of his spear. The scar-jawed leader stopped just outside the ring of carcasses. He looked at the 5 mammoths sprawled across the earth, then at Dakota's band, then back at the matriarch's tusks. His smile was slow, deliberate. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice carrying with an ease that suggested he was used to being heard. "Few have the courage or the skill to bring down so many." Dakota said nothing. Silence, he had learned long ago, was not emptiness. It was a tool. The man's smile sharpened. But courage without wisdom is dangerous. This, he gestured lazily to the kill, is more than you can carry, more than you can protect. It will rot before you can use it. And rot serves no one. Ayanna stepped forward, her face unreadable, but her voice hard as stone. "We hunted. We bled. We paid the price. The law says this kill is ours." The rival leader tilted his head, as if considering the word law like it was some exotic fruit. Then he chuckled. "The law is what the living say it is. And right now, there are more of us than there are of you." A ripple of unease moved through Dakota's band, but no one stepped back. Nakai shifted slightly, his spear angled just enough to show intent without making a promise he couldn't yet keep. Dakota finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried like flint-striking steel. "If you think numbers win hunts, you've already forgotten why mammoths fear men." That made the rival leader's smile falter for the first time. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the mask. He took a step closer, his boots sinking slightly into the blood-soaked earth. "I don't want to waste men," he said, "or time. So here's what I offer. We take the tusks and half the meat. You keep the rest. Everyone lives." Ayanna laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You call that an offer?" The rival leader's smile returned, colder this time. "It's generosity. Refuse." And he gestured vaguely to his hunters, who shifted their weight in unison like a single creature waiting to pounce. "We'll see who survives to tell this story." Dakota let the words hang in the air. He could feel his people's eyes on him, waiting, trusting, afraid but not broken. He thought of Aote's lessons, of the way the old man had explained that hunting was never about strength alone. It was about control, the control to wait, to strike, to make the other side believe the fight was already lost. "Half the meat," Dakota said slowly, "and the tusks." He paused, then tilted his head. "That's what you think you need?" The rival leader frowned slightly, sensing something in the tone but not yet sure what. "You're wrong," Dakota continued, his voice gaining weight. "You don't want meat. You want to own the kill. You want to stand on this ground and make the world believe you're the kind of man mammoths die for." The scar-jawed man's nostrils flared. And here's your problem," Dakota said, stepping forward now, his own movements deliberate, his shadow falling across the matriarch's tusk. "You didn't kill them. We did. And no matter what happens next, the earth will remember that." A murmur rippled through the rival group, small but real. Pride was a delicate thing, even among predators. The rival leader's jaw tightened. "Words," he said finally. "The earth remembers blood, not words." Dakota's grip on his spear tightened almost imperceptibly. He felt the shift coming, the moment when talk would turn to something harder, sharper, irreversible. Ayanna sensed it too. She angled her body just slightly, her stance ready but unspoken. Nakai licked his lips, muttering something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse, maybe both. The rival hunters began to spread out, not in retreat, but in preparation, their circle widening to flank Dakota's band, The space between the two groups shrank, not physically, but in the way danger collapses distance. Dakota glanced at the matriarch one last time, at the way her massive body seemed to anchor the killing ground like a monument. She had been a force of nature, and now she was a stage for men to decide what they were willing to become. The raven on her tusk croaked once, the sound jagged and almost mocking. And then the rival leader lowered his spear, just slightly, just enough to shift it from a symbol of claim to a promise of violence. "Take them," he said. The world held its breath, and then it exhaled in steel and stone and screams. The first spear didn't whistle through the air, it screamed. A raw, violent sound, torn from muscle and stone, cutting the silence like a blade through sinew. It struck one of Dakota's hunters in the thigh, a glancing blow, not fatal, but enough to drop him to one knee with a cry that turned everyone's hesitation to fire. Then the valley erupted. There was no formation, no elegant strategy, just the collision of two hungers, one to defend, the other to take. Spears flew in jagged arcs, some finding flesh, others shattering on bone or stone. The earth beneath the mammoths turned slick, treacherous, and men slipped as they fought, rising again only because falling meant dying. Dakota moved like someone who had no choice but forward. He slammed his shoulder into an attacker, felt the man's ribs flex beneath the impact, then drove the butt of his spear into the soft place beneath his jaw. The rival hunter gurgled once and dropped. Dakota didn't watch him fall. There was no time to witness anything fully. Nakai was a flash of motion to his left, his younger brother's face smeared with blood that might not have been his own. He darted between carcasses, using their bulk as shields, striking from shadows like a desert cat. Ayana fought differently, lower, heavier, each strike of her stone blade deliberate and final. Her breath came in controlled bursts, as if she had decided long ago that panic was something other people felt. The rival leader, scar-jawed, eyes burning with something that was not rage but calculation, didn't fight like his men. He didn't rush. He stalked. He moved through the chaos with an unsettling calm, his spear always ready, his strikes measured and purposeful. When he killed, it was with the efficiency of someone who believed killing was simply a form of writing his name into the earth. The mammoths loomed over them all, grotesque monuments to the cause of this slaughter. Blood pooled around their trunks and tusks, mixing human and animal into a single, indistinguishable red. A raven, undisturbed by the carnage, hopped across the matriarch's flank, plucking at the torn hide as though mocking the humans for thinking they owned any of this. Dakota caught sight of one of his hunters, Kuruk's cousin, a boy barely old enough to nap his own spear points, being dragged backward by two rivals. Without thinking, Dakota hurled his atlatl. The spear drove through one man's shoulder, spinning him off balance, and the boy used the moment to twist free, slashing wildly with his knife until the second attacker stumbled away. The boy met Dakota's eyes for a brief second, terror and gratitude warring in his expression. Then he was swallowed by the fight again. The battle wasn't clean. It wasn't even about winning anymore. It was about not disappearing. Men bit and clawed when they lost their weapons. Stones meant for carving meat became bludgeons for breaking skulls. Somewhere, someone screamed a name over and over until their voice cracked, and then the screaming stopped. Dakota found himself face to face with the scar-jawed leader. Up close, the man's features were harsh and strangely beautiful in their brutality. They circled each other warily, the noise of the fight dimming around them, as though the earth itself was waiting to see how this moment would end. "You should have given us what we asked for," the scar-jawed man said, his voice even, almost conversational, though his spear never wavered. "You should have earned it," Dakota replied. They moved at the same instant. Dakota thrust low, aiming for the thigh. Scarjaw twisted aside, his own spear flashing toward Dakota's ribs. Dakota felt the scrape of stone against skin, hot and immediate, but he didn't falter. He closed the distance, ramming his shoulder into the man's chest. They went down together, rolling in the blood-slick mud. Scarjaw was strong, stronger than Dakota expected. He pinned Dakota's arm, driving his knee into Dakota's chest, trying to force his knife down toward Dakota's throat. Dakota bucked hard, twisting his hips, feeling the knife's edge kiss his skin. Then Nakai was there. He didn't hesitate. His spear drove cleanly through Scarjaw's back, the tip bursting from his chest in a bloom of dark blood. The rival leader froze, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no sound came. His body sagged, heavy and final, and then he was still. For a moment, everything paused. The rival hunters saw their leader fall, and something in them cracked. Some roared in defiance, surging forward with reckless fury. Others faltered, their strikes losing purpose, their feet edging backward without quite meaning to. Dakota shoved the corpse aside and rose, his breath tearing in and out of him like wind through broken branches. He snatched up his spear, raised it high, and shouted, not words, just sound, raw and undeniable. His band answered, their voices merging into something primal, something older than language. The rival hunters broke. Not all of them. Some fought to the death, unwilling or unable to surrender, but enough. They scattered back toward the ridge, dragging their wounded, leaving the ground to those who had paid for it in blood twice over. When the noise finally ebbed, when the last spear had fallen silent, Dakota stood among the wreckage. His people were alive, but barely. 4 of his hunters wouldn't rise again. Others were maimed, limping, bleeding, shaking from pain they couldn't yet feel fully. Ayanna sank to her knees beside the matriarch again. Her hands trembled now, not from fear, but from exhaustion, so deep it seemed to reach into her bones. Nakai stood nearby, staring at the dead leader with an expression Dakota couldn't quite read. Then Ayanna spoke, her voice hoarse but steady. "They'll come back." Dakota didn't argue. She was right. This wasn't over. The rival band had tasted blood, both theirs and the Mammoths. They would want more. On the horizon, smoke rose from another ridge. Another band, drawn by the sound of slaughter, by the scent of death. Dakota gripped his spear tighter. He realized then that the hunt had never really been about the Mammoths. It was about what came after, when the giants were gone and only men were left to decide what kind of world they wanted to inherit. And the world they were making now was sharp, hungry, and full of teeth. The air still tasted of iron. Dakota crouched by the matriarch's fallen body, his hands pressed into the churned mud as if the earth might steady him. Around him, the valley breathed in ragged gasps, the sound of men too tired to weep and too proud to scream. Blood clung to everything, to spears, to hides, to the grooves of their palms. It soaked the ground until it seemed the soil itself was bleeding. Nakai limped toward him, dragging a length of broken spear behind him like a tail. 4 dead, he said. His voice was flat, stripped of anything human. 2 more won't last the day. Dakota didn't look up. He traced the mammoth's tusk with his fingertips, following the spiral of its growth, imagining each ring as a season of patience. 60 winters, maybe more, curled into that white arc. Now it ended here, in their hands, because they had decided their hunger was more important than her memory. Ayanna approached from the other side, her movements deliberate, like someone balancing on the edge of a blade. She carried Kuruk's knife. "We should burn them," she said softly. "The dead?" Nakai asked. "No," she said, glancing at the mammoths. "The bones, so no one else fights for them." Dakota finally lifted his head. Her suggestion wasn't madness, it was clarity, the kind that came only when something inside you had already broken. But he shook his head. "We need the tusks," he said. "We need everything." Ayanna didn't argue. She just looked at him for a long time, and he couldn't tell if her silence was agreement or accusation. They worked through the night, not to honor the dead, but to survive them. Flesh came first. They cut in practiced motions, each slice mechanical, each twist of the blade echoing lessons whispered across generations. But there was no rhythm this time, no song to guide their hands. Only the wet tearing of sinew and the occasional hiss of pain when a wound reminded a hunter he was still alive. Nakai kept glancing toward the ridge. Shadows moved there, too deliberate to be wind. "They're watching," he said. "They'll come," Ayanna replied, not lifting her gaze from the tendon she was separating from bone. "Then why not run now?" One of the younger hunters asked, his voice brittle. "Take what we can carry and leave the rest for them." Nakai cut in, his tone sharp enough to draw blood. "So they grow strong on what we killed? So they come for us fatter and better armed?" The boy swallowed whatever argument he had. Dakota said nothing. His knife kept moving, almost of its own accord. Every cut felt like a conversation he didn't want to have. At dawn, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke. Dakota straightened, scanning the horizon. Another band was signaling, a column of gray rising from the far ridge. Not rivals this time. Allies, or at least not enemies. For now. "They'll want to share," Ayanna said. "They'll want more than that," Nakai muttered. "They'll want to decide what happens next." Dakota wiped his blade on his thigh, leaving a dark smear across already darkened skin. "Then we let them," he said. Nakai turned sharply toward him. "You'd give them what we bled for." "I'd give them what keeps us alive," Dakota replied, and realized as he said it that he wasn't sure he believed himself. When the Allies arrived, they didn't come charging or shouting. They came like the morning itself, quiet, inevitable. Their leader, Kusumi, walked at their head, his face painted in ash, his eyes scanning the scene not with greed, but with calculation. "The ravens told us of your success," he said formally. His gaze flicked to the bodies of the dead hunters, then back to Dakota. "And of your cost." Dakota offered him a tusk, symbol first, resource second. "The ancestors guided our spears," he said, matching the formality. "They guide yours now." The exchange bound them, though not in trust. Trust was a luxury neither side could afford. What they shared was simpler, harsher. The understanding that tomorrow's hunt would devour today's alliances. That night, as the Allies camped beside them, Dakota lay awake under a sky smeared with stars. The cold seeped into his bones, but it was the silence that kept him from sleep. No trumpeting calls from the mammoths, no thunder of their feet. The world already sounded emptier. Ayanna rolled onto her side, her voice a whisper. "Do you think they know?" she asked. "Who?" "The mammoths. Do you think they know their ending?" Dakota thought of the matriarch's final moment, the way she had turned her head, as if to look at him not in fear but in recognition. "I think they knew before we did," he said. Nakai, half asleep nearby, grunted. "Knowing doesn't save them," he muttered. "No," Ayanna said. "But maybe it saves us." Dakota wanted to ask her what she meant, but her breathing had already settled into the rhythm of sleep, leaving him alone with the question. In the days that followed, they buried their dead in shallow graves near the spring, marking each with a fluted spear point pressed into the soil. It was Ayanna's idea, and though no one said it aloud, They all understood why. To remind themselves that their weapons weren't just for killing, they were for remembering. But remembrance did little to ease the hunger. The meat from the mammoths would last weeks if guarded, maybe months if dried and stored. Yet everyone knew it wasn't enough. Not because the food would run out, but because the fights wouldn't stop. Word of their kill had spread, and now the valley drew people like blood draws flies. Bands arrived in 2s and 3s, their faces lean, their eyes hungrier than their bodies. Some came with offerings, obsidian cores, hides, even children to foster alliances through marriage. Others came with demands. A few came with knives already drawn. For the first time, Dakota saw something he had never imagined. Men arguing not about how to hunt, but about what hunting meant. One elder spoke of the mammoth as a gift, a sacred trust that must be taken only with reverence. Another spat in the dirt and said reverence didn't fill bellies. A third proposed heresy outright, that they should stop chasing giants altogether and turn to smaller prey, even if it meant abandoning the ways that made them Clovis. The arguments didn't stay words for long. Blood spilled again, quieter this time, but no less real. By the third night, the ground near the spring was layered with footprints so dense they turned to mud. It looked less like a hunting ground and more like a grave being dug by many hands. Through it all, Dakota felt himself splitting. One part of him clung to the old rhythm, the hunter who measured his life in tracks and throws, in the silent geometry of predator and prey. But another part, a part he didn't yet trust, began to think of the world differently. Not as something to be stalked, but as something to be shaped. Ayanna noticed it too. "You're quieter," she said one evening, as they worked together to lash tusks into a travois. Not like before. Not like a hunter listening. Like someone waiting. "Waiting for what?" he asked. "For whatever comes after," she said. Nakai overheard and snorted. "After? There is no after. There's only the next hunt." But even as he said it, his eyes betrayed him. He had seen the smoke signals rising farther east, the scouts returning with stories of herds thinning, of calves growing sick and not surviving winters. He had seen what Dakota had seen, that the world was tilting beneath their feet, and no amount of spears could hold it steady. On the 5th day, a runner arrived, a girl no older than 12, her legs trembling from the distance she had covered. She collapsed at the edge of the camp, gasping out words between breaths. "Blackwater, draw," she managed. "They're gathering, all of them." The phrase passed through the camp like fire through dry grass. All of them. Every band that still carried Clovis points, every hunter who still believed in giants. A last convergence, not just for meat, but for meaning. Dakota felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not hope, but a pull, as if the earth itself had thrown a rope around his ribs and begun to reel him in. The girl's message left the camp suspended between stillness and motion. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The idea had already taken root, sinking deep like a spear driven into the earth. "Blackwater, draw." Ayanna's fingers tightened around the edge of the travois. "If we go," she said quietly, "we won't come back the same." Dakota almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "We didn't come back the same from here." Nakai stood apart, his profile carved sharp by the firelight. "This isn't a choice," he said finally. "If they gather without us, they decide who we are without us. And then we're nothing." Dakota looked past him, past the dying fire, to where the mammoth skulls gleamed pale under the stars. They looked like islands of bone rising from a dark sea, silent witnesses to the story being written in their absence. For a moment, he imagined them lifting their heads, watching the humans they had nourished march off to end what they had started. That night, He dreamed of rivers, not the kind that wound through valleys, but rivers of people, all flowing toward a single place. Their faces were painted in ash, their spears tipped with obsidian, their voices rising in a song that sounded less like triumph and more like surrender. When he woke, the decision was already made. They would leave at first light. As dawn broke, they dismantled their camp with a precision born of habit, though it felt different this time, less like leaving a place and more like shedding a skin. Each man and woman took what they could carry. The rest they left behind for scavengers. Wolves watched from the ridge, their yellow eyes reflecting the new sun. One of them howled, long and low, and it sounded to Dakota less like hunger and more like warning. Ayanna adjusted the strap across her shoulder. "Do you think they'll come too?" she asked, nodding toward the wolves. Dakota thought of the matriarch kneeling in the mud, of the raven perched on her tusk, of the wolves circling the feast of ashes. "Everything comes to an ending," he said. "Even the witnesses." They started walking. At first, it was just their band, a thin line of figures cutting across the empty land. But as the day wore on, others joined, small groups at first, then larger ones, until the line swelled into a river, just like in his dream. Spears flashed in the light, obsidian points like shards of captured night. Children rode on shoulders, wide-eyed, as if sensing that they were being carried not just toward a place, but toward a story that would never be told the same way again. Somewhere ahead, beyond the horizon, Blackwater Draw waited. Dakota didn't know if it would be a place of salvation or a grave big enough to hold the memory of giants. He only knew this: whatever happened there would decide what it meant to be human. And for the first time since the hunt began, that thought frightened him more than the mammoths ever had. The horizon stretched wide and unforgiving as Dakota's band approached Blackwater Draw. The air was thick with dust, rising like a ghost from the earth, and the distant shapes of other hunters appeared like flickering shadows on the rim of the valley. The great convergence was no longer a rumor whispered around fires. It was a living, breathing force, gathering strength with every step they took. Dakota felt the weight of the journey press on him, not just the physical exhaustion, but the crushing reality that what lay ahead would reshape everything they had known. Behind him, Nakai moved with restless energy, eyes scanning the terrain as if daring the land itself to challenge their passage. Ayanna walked steadily beside Dakota, her hands steady despite the tension coiling in her muscles. The camp at Blackwater Draw sprawled across the valley floor like a scattered constellation of spears, fires, and human bodies. Bands from miles around had come, each bearing their own markings, their own stories etched in paint and bone. Some faces were familiar, echoes of past alliances or skirmishes. Others were strangers, wild-eyed and wary. The air hummed with whispered conversations, cautious greetings, and the occasional sharp bark of command. The hunters moved with a practiced urgency, assembling their weapons, tending to wounds, sharing dried meat and bitter roots in silent communion. There was no pretense of festivity here, only the grim recognition of a task that might be their last. Dakota and his band found a space near the spring where the oldest mammoth bones lay bleached by sun and wind. It was a sacred ground now, a graveyard that reminded them why they had come. He knelt, brushing his fingers across a fragment of ivory, feeling the rough grain beneath his skin. The past was present here, a ghost beneath their feet. "Look at them," Nakai said, voice low as he nodded toward a group of hunters sharpening spears. "They don't just carry weapons. They carry history." Ayanna's eyes followed his gaze. "And they carry fear," she added. "Fear of what's to come." The days before the hunt were a crucible. Allies mingled with rivals, old debts and new grievances surfaced like shadows in the firelight. Around them, The delicate dance of politics played out with subtle gestures and sharpened words. Trust was a currency too precious to spend lightly. Kasumi approached, his face unreadable beneath the war paint. "You brought your best," he said to Dakota. "Your people will honor the hunt." Dakota nodded. "And we will honor the fallen." The old ritual was whispered among the bands. Kill the matriarch, scatter the herd, take only what is needed, honor the earth. But this time, the rules felt fragile, stretched thin by hunger and desperation. Children watched wide-eyed from the edges of campfires, clutching small talismans, carved bones and painted stones, symbols of protection for a world they might never fully understand. Elders spoke in low tones of the mammoths' long watch over the land and the price of their absence. As the sun dipped behind the Dragoon Mountains, a hush fell. The hunters gathered in circles, faces lit by flickering flames and dark shadows. Speeches were made, some prayers, some warnings. The weight of what they were about to do settled over them like a storm cloud. Dakota felt a knot in his stomach tighten as the last embers glowed. He glanced at Nakai and Ayana, each lost in their own thoughts, each carrying the heavy burden of what this hunt meant. Tomorrow, the valley would run red again. Dawn broke like a blade. The first light spilled across Blackwater Draw, cutting the valley into sharp contrasts of shadow and fire. Hundreds of hunters stood poised at the ridges, their silhouettes jagged against the glowing horizon. Spears glinted like captured lightning, and the air vibrated with the unspoken knowledge that today would end an age. Dakota's breath steamed in the cold air as he crouched beside Nakai and Ayana. Below them, the mammoths grazed in the mist, a colossal herd, their dark shapes moving slowly, deliberately, like islands drifting in a gray sea. The matriarch raised her head, trunk curling, scenting the wind. Even from this distance, Dakota could see the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet understanding of what was coming. "They know," Ayana whispered. "They always know," Dakota said, though his voice caught in his throat. A signal passed through the hunters, not a word, not a sound, but a shared intention that rippled like fire through dry grass. Movement erupted at once. A flood of bodies pouring down the ridges, spears raised, atlatls drawn back. The earth trembled beneath the charge. The mammoths responded with terrifying grace. The matriarch bellowed, a sound that shook Dakota's bones, and the herd coalesced around her, forming a living wall of tusks and muscle. The ground became chaos, dust and blood mingling with the screams of men and the trumpets of giants. Dakota hurled his first spear. It flew like a shard of his own breath and struck a young bull in the flank. The animal staggered but didn't fall. Nakai was already sprinting past him, his movements reckless and fluid, hurling spear after spear, each one finding its mark with brutal efficiency. Ayana stayed low, aiming carefully, her hands steady even as the herd surged toward them like a tidal wave. The hunter's strategy was as old as memory. Confuse the herd, isolate the matriarch, bring her down first. But against so many mammoths, even strategy felt like desperation. Men were crushed underfoot, their screams cut short by the weight of 10,000 years of survival crashing down on them. Spears shattered against bone. Blood, human and mammoth alike, sprayed across the blackened earth. Dakota found himself face to face with the matriarch. Her tusks swept wide, catching one of his bandmates and tossing him through the air like a rag doll. Her eyes locked on his, and for a heartbeat, time stilled. He saw not rage, but recognition, as though she understood that they were both trapped in the same ending. He drove his grandfather's Clovis point into the gap behind her foreleg, exactly as he had been taught. The stone sank deep, and the matriarch let out a sound that was less a roar and more a lament, a note so heavy with grief it carved itself into Dakota's marrow. She staggered, then fell, shaking the ground as if the earth itself had taken a blow. The herd broke. Some fled toward the open plains, their trumpets fading into the mist. Others circled wildly, disoriented, trampling anything in their path. The hunters pressed their advantage, turning the chaos into slaughter. More mammoths fell. More men fell with them. And then, as if summoned by the scent of blood, rival bands appeared from the edges of the valley. They had waited for this moment, to strike when the herd was weakened and the hunters were exhausted. Spears meant for mammoths now found human targets. Shouts rose above the din, accusations hurled like weapons. Thieves. Cowards. Traitors. Dakota's band tightened into a defensive knot. Nakai fought like a creature possessed, cutting down anyone who came too close. Ayana dragged a wounded hunter behind a fallen mammoth, her face streaked with mud and blood but her hands precise, purposeful. Dakota felt something shift inside him as he watched the valley unravel. This wasn't a hunt anymore. It wasn't even a battle. It was an unraveling of everything that had held them together. The rules, the rituals, the shared belief that killing giants meant becoming something greater. Now, it just meant surviving. As the sun climbed higher, the valley was a tapestry of carnage. Mammoths lying like toppled monuments, hunters sprawled among them, the dust choked with the smell of iron and smoke. Ravens circled overhead, patient as gods. Dakota stood, chest heaving, hands slick with blood that was no longer his own. Around him, the screams and the trumpets began to fade, replaced by a hollow silence that felt heavier than the noise had ever been. And then he saw them. A new wave of hunters cresting the ridge, their faces painted in colors he didn't recognize, their spears tipped with points sharper than anything he had seen before. Nakai followed his gaze and cursed under his breath. "They're not here to hunt," he said. "They're here to take everything." Dakota tightened his grip on his atlatl. For the first time, he wasn't sure who the enemy was, the mammoths they had come to kill, or the humans who had come to kill what was left of them. The dust had not yet settled from the first wave of slaughter when Dakota realized the valley had changed. The chaos of men and mammoths had been violent, yes, but it had still felt like a hunt, a desperate, brutal ritual with rules older than memory. Now those rules were gone. The rival bands pouring into Blackwater Draw had turned it into something else entirely. Not a hunt, but an ending. He gripped his atlatl until his knuckles turned white, his chest heaving as he scanned the broken herd below. Mammoths stumbled through the churned mud, their dark hides smeared with blood and dust. Some still fought to shield the calves, while others, maddened by pain and terror, charged blindly into clusters of hunters. Overhead, ravens wheeled in widening circles, as if marking the moment the world tilted off its axis. Dakota crouched beside the body of a fallen hunter, someone from another band, his face painted in colors Dakota didn't recognize. He wasn't sure if it mattered anymore whose side anyone had been on. Across the valley, Nakai was shouting, voice raw, urging their small band to regroup near a toppled mammoth whose massive ribs jutted upward like the frame of a shattered ship. Ayana was already there, her hands slick with blood as she bound a wounded man's arm, her movements sharp and efficient, even as her eyes darted constantly toward the shifting lines of the fight. A surge of movement to the north drew Dakota's gaze. The matriarch of another family group had turned to face the hunters, her tusks glinting like pale scythes in the morning sun. Around her, calves bleated and pressed close, their trunks groping blindly for comfort she could no longer give. Something in her stance, a defiance that looked almost regal, pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain. He rose, muscles trembling but mind clear. "We finish it," he muttered, though whether he meant for his people or for hers, he didn't know. Nakai sprinted along the mammoth's flank, using the dead giant's body as cover as he hurled another spear. His breath came in ragged bursts, and the muscles of his arms ached from throwing again and again, but adrenaline drove him forward like fire through dry grass. He wasn't thinking about the sacredness of the hunt anymore. He wasn't even thinking about food. He was thinking about winning, because if they didn't win, they didn't live. A rival hunter broke from the melee, charging straight at him with a club raised high. Nakai didn't hesitate. He shifted his weight, feinted left, then drove the butt of his spear into the man's chest. The rival went down with a grunt, swallowed almost instantly by the churning mud and stampeding feet of men and beasts alike. Nakai didn't watch him fall. His eyes were locked on the calves. "Stay behind her," he muttered to himself as he prepared another throw. "Stay behind her, and maybe you'll live." Ayanna worked with grim precision, cutting strips of hide from a fallen mammoth even as she pressed her body low to avoid stray spears. Her hands moved without hesitation, but her mind was elsewhere, flitting between the faces of her band, the cries of the dying, and the impossible question that had begun to root itself in her chest. What if this isn't victory at all? She tied off the wound she'd been dressing and glanced up just in time to see the matriarch rear back, trumpeting so loudly that Ayanna felt it in her bones. The sound was not just defiance. It was grief, an ocean of it, spilling across the valley and drowning out the screams of men. Ayanna's throat tightened. For a moment, she imagined herself on the other side of the hunt, imagined seeing her world end beneath the spears of creatures who killed not just to eat, but to claim the land itself. The matriarch felt her leg buckle as another spear tore into her flesh. Her breath came in heavy bursts, each exhalation tasting of copper and dust. Around her, her family cried and stumbled, their trunks reaching for her guidance even as they began to scatter. Her eyes caught a glimpse of one calf, small, trembling, its sides heaving in terror, and something ancient stirred in her chest. She remembered the rivers that no longer flowed, the grasslands that had withered under a sun that felt harsher with each season. She remembered the scent of her mother, and her mother's mother, leading her down the same paths that now ran red with blood. And though she did not know the word for it, she understood what this moment meant. Her kind was ending. She lowered her head and charged, not to flee, but to carve a final memory into the earth. Dakota saw her coming. Time fractured into shards of motion. The matriarch's tusks slicing through the air, Nakai pivoting to avoid her charge, Ayanna shouting something he couldn't hear over the thunder of feet. He felt his grandfather's Clovis point in his hand, cold, perfect, a weapon made for this single act. He stepped forward, every muscle screaming, and hurled. The spear flew truer than any he had ever thrown, striking the matriarch behind the shoulder, sinking deep. She stumbled but didn't fall. With a final surge, she plowed through a line of hunters, tossing bodies aside like broken branches, before collapsing in a shudder that rippled through the ground and into Dakota's bones. The valley went quiet for a heartbeat. Then everything broke at once. Rival bands descended on the carcasses like vultures, fighting not just for meat but for dominance. Spears meant for mammoths now flew between men. Bloodlines and alliances were torn apart in the frenzy. The mammoths, what remained of them, fled toward the edges of the valley, their trumpets fading into the rising wind. Dakota staggered to Nakai's side. His brother's face was streaked with mud and blood, his chest heaving with exhaustion, but his grin was fierce and unbroken. "We did it," Nakai said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. Ayanna joined them, her hands shaking as she wiped them on her tunic. "No," she said softly, her voice nearly lost in the chaos. "We ended it." Above them, the ravens began to descend, black shapes blotting out the pale morning sky. One landed on the matriarch's tusk, cocked its head, and let out a single harsh cry, a sound that seemed less like triumph and more like judgment. Dakota stared at the bird, then at the valley around him. The toppled giants, the bodies of men, the churned earth that would bear the memory of this day long after they were all gone. Something inside him shifted, an understanding as sharp and heavy as the Clovis point he had thrown. This was not just the death of a herd. This was the death of a story, one so old it had felt eternal. The wind carried the smell of blood for miles. It was thicker than smoke, heavier than rain, a weight that pressed on the lungs of every creature in Blackwater Draw. By midday, the frenzy had dulled into something slower, heavier, a mechanical disassembly of giants. Hunters carved through hide and tendon with the precision of people who had done this all their lives, yet no one spoke above a murmur. Even the rival bands, who hours before had been ready to kill each other, worked side by side now, their movements wary but synchronized, as though some unspoken law had emerged from the carnage. Dakota stood apart, ankle-deep in churned mud, staring at the matriarch. Her body had begun to cool, the steam rising from her flesh thinning as the sun climbed higher. A raven hopped along her tusk, its claws scratching faintly against the ivory. It paused to look at him, head tilted, before taking flight with a slow, deliberate beat of its wings. Nakai approached, dragging a bundle of meat tied in sinew. His shoulders were slumped, his grin from earlier gone. "We'll eat for months," he said, though his voice carried no satisfaction. "Maybe longer if the caches hold." "Months," Dakota echoed. The word felt small, meaningless against the enormity of what lay around them. A valley of corpses, 412 mammoths felled by 500 hunters. His hand drifted to the haft of his spear, still sticky with blood, and he found himself whispering a question he hadn't known was forming. And then what? Ayanna was kneeling by a young hunter from another band, binding a deep gash on his thigh. He was shaking, teeth clenched against the pain, but he held still as she worked. Around her, the women moved like shadows, stripping hides, sorting bones, separating usable sinew from spoiled flesh. Survival demanded efficiency, and efficiency allowed no room for grief, but Ayanna felt grief anyway. It pressed against her ribs like something trying to escape. She glanced toward Dakota. He was staring at the matriarch as though expecting her to rise again, to shake off the spears and return the world to what it had been. Ayanna envied that hope, even if she knew it was impossible. Nearby, Kosumi, the elder of a rival band, raised his voice just enough to be heard. "We divide the tusks evenly," he announced. "Meat by family count. No hoarding, no theft." No one argued. They all understood that today's rules were not about fairness. They were about preventing a second slaughter. Later, as the sun bled toward the horizon, the hunters gathered in a loose circle around the matriarch's skull. There was no ceremony. No one had planned for a moment like this. Yet instinct compelled them to stand still, to acknowledge what they had done. Kosumi spoke first. "The earth will remember," he said, voice cracking from exhaustion. "And so will we." Nakai shifted uncomfortably, muttering under his breath, "If we live long enough to tell it." Dakota stepped forward. His body ached, every muscle taut with fatigue, but his voice was steady. "We hunted because we had to," he said, meeting the eyes of men and women who were strangers to him, but now bound by this shared act. "But this," he gestured to the valley, to the scattered bones and the dark pools of blood soaking into the ground. "This is not just a hunt. It is the breaking of something we may never be able to mend." No one answered. Perhaps there was nothing to say. That night, the fires burned low. Wolves edged closer to the kill site, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Instead of driving them away, the hunters tossed scraps of meat toward the shadows, an unspoken truce forged by mutual need. Ayanna watched a pack leader drag a haunch into the trees, her movements cautious but deliberate. "They'll remember," she murmured. "Wolves always do," Nakai replied, lying on his back and staring at the stars. Maybe they'll tell the story better than us. Dakota didn't join the conversation. He sat apart, turning a Clovis point in his hands. It was one of Tala's new designs, sharper and more deadly than anything his grandfather had made. He thought of Tala's words. Each point is a countdown to 0. Tonight, it felt like they had reached 0. Over the next days, the valley transformed. The mammoths' bodies diminished under knives and weather, their massive shapes shrinking into neat stacks of hide, bone, and meat. Children who had been kept away from the slaughter were finally brought to the edge of the site. They stared wide-eyed at the carcasses, some reaching out timidly to touch the cooling tusks, as though by touching them they could absorb their power. Ayana crouched beside one girl, Kimmy's daughter, toddling on unsteady legs. The child pressed her palm against a rib that curved taller than she was. Ayana imagined the story she might tell when she was older, how her voice might falter when she tried to explain what a mammoth had been to someone who had never seen one alive. "They won't believe us," Ayana said quietly to Dakota, who had come to stand beside her. "They will," he replied, though his tone carried no conviction. "But they won't understand." When the caches were finally full and the last tusk loaded onto travois, the rival bands began to scatter. Some headed north toward the tundra, others west to the desert's edge. There were no farewells, only nods and brief glances that carried both recognition and warning. "We survived this together. Do not assume we will survive the next the same way." Kasumi paused before leaving, resting a weathered hand on Dakota's shoulder. "You threw the spear that brought her down," he said. "That means the story begins with you." Dakota almost laughed. "Stories don't begin," he said, staring at the line of mammoth tracks that still marked the earth, leading nowhere. "They just keep changing who tells them." As they prepared to leave, a storm rolled in from the west. The first drops of rain struck the valley like beads of cold stone, raising the smell of iron and earth. The hunters covered their loads, tightened their bindings, and began their slow march away from the killing ground. Behind them, scavengers surged to claim what was left: wolves, ravens, and the smaller creatures that had always waited patiently for giants to fall. Ayana glanced back once, watching the rain blur the shapes of tusks and bones until they seemed less like bodies and more like monuments. She wondered how long they would last. A season? A year? Long enough for grass to grow through them, for the earth to pull them back into itself? On their second night of travel, Dakota dreamed of the matriarch. In his dream, she stood uninjured in a meadow that no longer existed, surrounded by her family. She didn't charge him this time. She didn't flee. She simply looked at him with eyes so dark and deep they seemed to hold the reflection of the entire world. When he woke, the dream clung to him like frost. He didn't tell Nakai or Ayana. Some things couldn't be spoken without breaking them. Weeks later, they reached a river valley rich with bison and smaller game. Life, as it always did, demanded movement, demanded hunger, demanded forgetting. But forgetting, Dakota realized, wasn't the same as losing. The memory of the hunt traveled with them, in the tusks they hauled, in the tools they shaped from bone, in the stories they would begin to tell around their fires. One evening, as the band rested, Nakai asked, "Do you think we'll ever see another mammoth?" Dakota hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said, "but we'll see them everywhere." He pointed toward the horizon where storm clouds gathered, their shapes swollen and immense. In the sky, in the earth, in the way the ground remembers their steps. Ayana, listening nearby, said nothing. She only pressed her hand into the soil, feeling for vibrations that would never come again.